I pulled into the gravel parking lot of Haunted Hills just as the sun started painting the West Virginia hills orange. The place looked exactly like what you'd expect from a small-town amusement park that had seen better days. Faded paint on everything, weeds growing through cracks in the asphalt, and that general air of something that used to be fun, but now just felt tired. Jerome Ramsey was waiting by the entrance gate, checking his watch like he had somewhere important to be. He looked like the kind of supervisor who actually gave a damn about his job, which was more than I could say for most of the people I'd worked with in construction. Clean shirt, organized clipboard, the works. "You must be Peyton," he said, walking over with his hand extended. "Jerome Ramsey, day supervisor. Ready for the grand tour?" I shook his hand and nodded, even though I wasn't really ready for anything. 3 weeks ago, I'd been living in Charleston, thinking I was about to start my own contracting business. Now I was 2 hours away from everything I knew, about to spend my nights babysitting broken carnival rides because I needed the money and couldn't stand the thought of running into Marcus anywhere in the city. Jerome led me through the gate, past a ticket booth that looked like it hadn't sold anything in months. "Season doesn't start for another few weeks," he explained, "but we keep someone here overnight year-round. Insurance requirements, you know how it is." The midway stretched out in front of us, lined with rides that probably looked magical when they were lit up and running. Right now, they just looked like metal skeletons against the darkening sky. A Ferris wheel dominated the far end, its cars swaying slightly in the evening breeze. Closer to us, I could make out a carousel, some kind of fun house with a grinning clown face over the entrance, and various smaller rides scattered around. "Pretty standard setup," Jerome continued, walking at a pace that suggested he wanted to get through this quickly. "Your main job is just to make sure nobody breaks in, keep an eye on things. We've had some issues with teenagers trying to sneak in and mess around." We walked past the carousel, and I noticed how the painted horses seemed to follow us with their glass eyes. Probably just the way the light was hitting them, but it was unsettling enough that I looked away. "Security trailers over here," Jerome said, leading me toward a small building near the entrance. "Radio, first aid kit, all the basics. Pretty quiet job, honestly. Most nights nothing happens at all." He unlocked the trailer, and we stepped inside. It was cramped but functional. A desk, a couple of chairs, a radio setup, and a small refrigerator humming in the corner. Everything was neat and organized, which I appreciated. At least Jerome ran a tight ship. "Now, there are a few specific things about working nights here," he said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. The previous guard left some notes about the routine. Nothing too complicated, just some quirks about the place you should know about. He handed me the paper, and I could tell immediately that it had been folded and unfolded many times. The handwriting was shaky, like whoever wrote it had been in a hurry or maybe just nervous. I unfolded it and read, "Rules for night security at Haunted Hills. 1. Stay away from the Ferris wheel after 2 a.m. 2. Don't go near the carousel after 3 a.m. 3. Never enter the funhouse 4. Check on the dog every hour 5. Answer the payphone when it rings 6. Avoid the lake completely." I looked up at Jerome, waiting for him to explain the joke. When he didn't say anything, I read through the list again. "This is serious?" I asked. Jerome shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I know it seems odd, but we've found it's just easier to follow certain protocols. Keeps things running smoothly." "What dog?" "There's a German Shepherd mix we keep on the property. Previous owners left him behind when they sold, and he's been here ever since. Friendly enough, just needs someone to check on him regularly." I folded the paper and stuck it in my pocket. "And the payphone?" "Sometimes people call the main number after hours, emergencies, that sort of thing. Just answer it if it rings and take a message." None of it made much sense, but I'd worked enough weird jobs to know that every place had its own strange procedures. Maybe the previous guard had been paranoid, or maybe Jerome was just being overly cautious about liability issues. Either way, I needed this job too much to start asking difficult questions on my first day. Fair enough, I said. Anything else I should know? Jerome glanced at his watch again. I think that covers it. I'll leave you to get settled. Any problems? My number's on the desk. He was already heading for the door, moving with the kind of urgency that suggested he really didn't want to be here after dark. I followed him outside and watched as he walked quickly toward the parking lot. Jerome, I called after him. Where exactly is this dog? Near the entrance, he called back without turning around. You'll find him. His car started up immediately, and I watched his taillights disappear down the access road. So much for a thorough orientation. I stood there for a moment, looking around at the empty park. The sun had almost completely set now, and the rides were turning into dark silhouettes against the purple sky. It was quiet, except for the wind moving through the metal framework and the distant sound of traffic on the main road. I'd taken this job because I needed to get away from Charleston, away from the apartment I'd shared with Marcus, away from the construction sites where everyone knew what had happened to my business. The pay was decent, and the isolation had seemed like exactly what I needed. Now, standing alone in an empty amusement park with a list of bizarre rules in my pocket, I was starting to wonder if I'd made a mistake. But I'd made plenty of those lately, and at least this one came with a steady paycheck. I went back into the trailer and settled in at the desk, looking over the radio setup and familiarizing myself with the layout. The first aid kit was well stocked, and there was a detailed map of the park taped to the wall. I found the lake Jerome had mentioned, a small body of water behind the rides, probably used for some kind of water attraction during the season. At 11 o'clock, I figured I should start my first round. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from the desk and stepped back outside. The park felt completely different in the dark. My flashlight beam cut through the shadows between the rides, revealing glimpses of faded paint and rusted metal. Everything was still and quiet, but there was something about the silence that felt expectant, like the whole place was holding its breath. I walked the perimeter first, checking the fence line for any obvious security issues. Everything looked secure. The rides themselves were all properly shut down and locked up. Whatever teenagers Jerome was worried about would have a hard time getting into anything important. As I made my way back toward the entrance, I heard a soft whining sound. I followed it to a small shelter near the gate and found the dog Jerome had mentioned. He was bigger than I'd expected, probably 80 pounds of German Shepherd mixed with something else that had given him slightly longer fur and more expressive eyes. He was chained to a post with enough length to move around comfortably, and he had food and water bowls that looked recently filled. "Hey there," I said, approaching slowly with my hand extended. The dog's tail started wagging immediately, and he came over to sniff my fingers. He seemed friendly enough, just like Jerome had said. I scratched behind his ears, and he leaned into the attention like he'd been waiting for someone to notice him. "So, you're the reason I have to do hourly checks," I told him. "Could be worse jobs, I guess." He followed me to the end of his chain as I continued my round, watching as I walked away. There was something almost human about the way he looked at me, like he understood more than a dog should. I finished the circuit and headed back to the trailer, feeling pretty good about the whole situation. The rules might be weird, but the actual work seemed straightforward enough. Keep an eye on things, check on the dog, answer the phone if it rang. I'd had much worse jobs. It wasn't until I was almost back to the trailer that I noticed the payphone. I stopped dead, staring at it. It was mounted on a post about 20 feet from the trailer, right next to the path I'd walked at least 3 times already. An old-fashioned booth-style phone with a metal housing that reflected my flashlight beam. I was absolutely certain it hadn't been there before. I walked over to it slowly, playing my light over the metal surface. It looked like it had been there for years, weathered and worn, with scratches in the paint and a patina of age on the metal. The kind of thing that would have been installed when the park was built and never updated. But I knew I would have noticed it. I'd walked past this exact spot multiple times, and I wasn't the kind of person who missed obvious details. It was literally impossible that I could have overlooked something this size. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe the angle of my flashlight had been different before, Or maybe I'd been distracted by getting oriented. There had to be a logical explanation. The phone hung silent in its cradle, waiting. I reached out and touched the metal housing. It was real enough, solid and cold under my fingers. Whatever was going on, the phone was definitely there now. I went back to the trailer and sat down at the desk, pulling out the list of rules. Number 5. Answer the payphone when it rings. Not if it rings. When. I looked out the window at the phone, barely visible in the darkness. For the first time since I'd arrived, I started to think that maybe those rules weren't as silly as they'd seemed. I finished checking on the dog and was heading back to the trailer when he started growling. Not the kind of growl you hear when a dog spots a raccoon or hears a car backfire. This was something deeper, more primal. The hair along his spine stood straight up, and he was staring directly at the Ferris wheel. I followed his gaze and saw nothing but the dark outline of the ride against the night sky. But the dog kept growling, backing up until his chain went taut, his eyes never leaving that spot. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, but he just whined and pressed himself against his shelter. Every instinct I had told me to go investigate, to shine my flashlight on whatever had spooked him. But rule number 1 was pretty clear about staying away from the Ferris wheel after 2 a.m. and my watch showed 2:03. I'd been on the job for over 4 hours now, and I wasn't about to start breaking rules already. I went back to the trailer, but I couldn't shake the image of the dog's reaction. In construction, you learn to trust when something feels wrong. Animals are even better at sensing danger than people are. Whatever he'd seen or smelled near that Ferris wheel, it had scared him badly. 20 minutes passed. The dog had gone quiet, and I kept telling myself that whatever had bothered him was probably gone. Maybe it really had been just a raccoon or a stray cat. Maybe the rules were just Jerome being overly cautious about insurance liability. Maybe I was overthinking everything. At 2:25, curiosity won. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, planning to do a quick visual check from a safe distance, just to make sure everything was normal. The dog was lying down now, no longer agitated, which seemed like a good sign. I walked about halfway toward the Ferris wheel, staying well back from the ride itself, and played my light over the structure. That's when I saw them. Little points of light scattered across the wheel's frame, maybe 20 or 30 of them. They looked exactly like the stars kids draw with crayons. Simple 5-pointed shapes that glowed with a soft, steady light. They weren't electric bulbs or reflections from my flashlight. They were just there, hanging in the air around the metal framework like someone had stuck glow-in-the-dark stickers all over the ride. My stomach dropped as I took a step backward. The lights weren't moving, but there was something about the way they were positioned that made it seem like they were watching me. Like each one was an eye, and they were all focused on the spot where I stood. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight beam pointed at the ground. When I was far enough away that the lights were just barely visible, I turned and walked quickly back to the trailer. My hands were shaking as I closed the door behind me. Those lights definitely hadn't been there during my earlier rounds. I would have noticed something that obvious, which meant they'd appeared sometime in the last 20 minutes, right around the time the dog had started growling. I sat at the desk and stared out the window toward the Ferris wheel, but from this angle I couldn't see the lights anymore. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, but I knew I hadn't. They'd been real, and they'd been watching me. At 2:30 exactly, the payphone rang. The sound cut through the quiet midway like nails scraping metal. I'd been expecting it based on the rules, but actually hearing it made my skin crawl. The ring was harsh and mechanical, nothing like a modern phone. It sounded like something from decades ago. I walked over to it slowly, my flashlight beam bouncing with each step. The phone kept ringing, patient and insistent. When I picked up the receiver, the metal was cold against my ear. "Hello?" The voice that answered was barely human. It sounded like someone trying to talk through a mouthful of gravel, or maybe like a recording that had been played too many times and was starting to degrade. 7, it said. Then the line went dead. I stood there holding the receiver for a few seconds, listening to empty static. Then I hung up and went back to the trailer, my mind racing. The voice had been clear enough. It had definitely said 7. But 7 what? I sat down at the desk and pulled out the park map, studying it under the desk lamp. There were numbered locations marked all over it, probably for maintenance purposes or emergency reference. I found location 7 pretty quickly, the concession stand next to the carousel. That's when I noticed the piece of paper tucked behind the radio. It was folded small and wedged into the gap between the radio and the wall, like someone had hidden it there deliberately. I pulled it out and unfolded it. The handwriting was different from the rules list, neater, more controlled. It looked like it had been written by someone who'd had time to think about what they wanted to say. If you're reading this, the phone rang, and you answered it. The voice gives you numbers that correspond to locations on the park map. These are breaches, places where something is trying to come through. You have to find them and destroy them before they get bigger. They look like flesh-colored lumps about the size of a softball when they first appear. They'll be warm and they'll move slightly. You have to crush them completely and let the remains soak into the ground. Don't touch them with your bare hands. The smell will be bad, but it goes away. This is the most important part of the job. If you don't seal the breaches, everything else gets worse. I read through it twice, then looked at the map again. Location 7. The concession stand by the carousel. I really didn't want to go looking for flesh-colored lumps that moved and felt warm. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this was insane, that I should call Jerome and demand an explanation, or just walk away from the whole situation. But I thought about the lights on the Ferris wheel, and the way the dog had reacted, and the voice on the phone that definitely hadn't sounded human. Whatever was happening here, it was real. And if I was going to survive until morning, I needed to follow the instructions. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back outside. The concession stand was a small building with a serving window and a painted sign advertising funnel cakes and cotton candy. During the day, it probably looked cheerful and inviting. In the dark, with my flashlight casting weird shadows across the faded paint, it looked like something from a nightmare. I walked around to the back of the building, playing my light across the ground. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just weeds and scattered trash and the kind of debris you'd expect behind any old building. Then my light caught something that made my skin crawl. It was exactly what the note had described. A flesh-colored lump about the size of a softball, sitting in the weeds like someone had dropped it there. It was the wrong color for anything natural, too pink, too smooth. And as I watched, it moved slightly, pulsing like it was breathing. I stared at it for a long moment, fighting the urge to run. The thing was disgusting, but it was also somehow pathetic, like it was struggling to exist, trying to hold itself together through sheer will. I lifted my boot and brought it down hard. The thing burst like a rotten fruit, releasing a smell that was somehow worse than anything I'd ever encountered. It was the smell of meat that had been left in the sun too long, mixed with something chemical and sharp that burned my nostrils. Dark liquid seeped out of the crushed remains and soaked into the ground, leaving behind a stain that looked black in my flashlight beam. I backed away quickly, breathing through my mouth to avoid the smell. The note had been right. It was bad, but it was already starting to fade. As I hurried away from the concession stand, I could have sworn I heard the carousel music starting up behind me. Just a few notes, tinny and distorted, like an old music box winding down. When I turned to look, the ride was dark and still. But I was almost certain the painted horses had turned their heads to watch me go. I was trying not to look at the carousel as I walked past it to check on the dog, but you can't really avoid seeing something that big in your peripheral vision. The painted horses were moving, not the normal up and down motion you'd expect from a carousel. This was a slow, deliberate rotation, like someone was turning the whole platform by hand. Except there was no one there, and I was pretty sure the power to the rides had been shut off for the winter. The dog was waiting for me when I reached his shelter, whimpering softly and pressing his nose against the chain-link fence of his enclosure. When I knelt down to check his food and water, he immediately pushed against my leg, his warm body solid and reassuring in a way that surprised me. "Yeah, I know," I told him, scratching behind his ears. "This place is weird." He looked up at me with those two intelligent eyes, and I had the strangest feeling that he understood exactly what I meant. That maybe he was the only normal thing in this entire park, and he was just as unsettled by everything else as I was. I stayed with him longer than necessary, partly because the rules said to check on him hourly, and partly because his presence made the crawling sensation between my shoulder blades ease up a little. When I finally stood to leave, he followed me to the end of his chain again, watching as I walked back toward the midway. By the time I made it back to the trailer, my watch showed 3:47. I'd been here less than 5 hours and already felt like I'd aged a year. I sat down at the desk and tried to focus on the radio, checking the channels and making sure everything was working properly. Normal security guard stuff. The kind of tasks that reminded me this was supposed to be a regular job. At 4:15, I headed out for the next dog check. The carousel had stopped moving, which should have been a relief, but somehow felt worse, like it was pretending to be normal now that I was paying attention. I was halfway to the dog shelter when I saw the woman. She was standing near the entrance gate, close enough to the parking lot that she could have just arrived. Medium height, dark hair pulled back, wearing jeans and a denim jacket that looked too light for the October chill. She had a canvas bag slung over her shoulder and was looking around the park like she was searching for something specific. "Hey," I called out, walking toward her with my flashlight pointed down so I wouldn't blind her. "Park's closed. You can't be here." She turned toward me, and I could see she was maybe mid-30s with the kind of face that looked like it didn't smile often. "You must be the new guard," she said. "I'm Carol Estrada, Jerome's daughter." That stopped me short. Jerome hadn't mentioned having a daughter, and he definitely hadn't said anything about family members showing up in the middle of the night. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "Maintenance check," she said, but her eyes kept drifting toward the funhouse. "We had some storm damage last week, and I wanted to make sure everything was secure before the weekend." I looked around at the clear sky and the complete absence of any recent storm damage. At 4 in the morning? "I work days," she said. "This was the only time I could get out here." Something about her story felt off. She wasn't carrying any tools, and her clothes were too clean for someone planning to do repair work. Plus, there was the way she kept glancing toward the funhouse, like she was expecting something to happen. "Look," I said, "I'm going to need to call Jerome and verify." That's when the laughter started. It came from the funhouse, bursting out of the grinning clown mouth like someone had turned on a speaker system. But this wasn't the cheerful, mechanical laughter you'd expect from an amusement park ride. This was children's voices mixed with something deeper and more threatening, like adults pretending to be kids, but not quite getting it right. Carol grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my jacket with surprising strength. "Don't move," she whispered. "Don't look at it. Don't move toward it. Just stay right here." The laughter went on, echoing across the empty midway. I could hear individual voices in the mix, high-pitched giggles that turned into something that sounded more like screaming, deeper chuckles that had an edge of malice. It was the kind of sound that made your skin crawl and your brain insist that something was very, very wrong. I wanted to run. Every instinct I had was telling me to get as far away from that sound as possible. But Carol's grip on my arm kept me anchored, and something about her certainty made me trust her judgment. The laughter lasted exactly 3 minutes. I know because I was staring at my watch, counting the seconds and trying not to think about what could possibly be making that noise. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed felt almost as oppressive as the sound had been. Carol let go of my arm and stepped back, her face pale in my flashlight beam. "That's why you don't go in there," she said. "Ever." What the hell was that? Something you don't want to meet. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and started walking toward the parking lot. "I have to go, but I'll be back before dawn, with proper equipment." "Wait," I called after her. "What kind of equipment? What's really going on here?" She paused at the gate and looked back at me. "You've been following the rules, right? All of them?" I nodded, even though I wasn't sure why I was answering. "Good," she said. "Keep doing that. And don't let anyone convince you they're just suggestions." She was gone before I could ask any more questions, her footsteps crunching on the gravel as she walked to a car I hadn't noticed parked at the far edge of the lot. I watched her tail lights disappear down the access road, leaving me alone with more questions than I'd started with. The thing that bothered me most wasn't the laughter or even Carol's cryptic warnings. It was the fact that she'd known about the rules without me telling her. She'd talked about them like they were common knowledge, like everyone who spent time at this park understood exactly what they meant, which suggested that whatever was happening here had been going on for a while, long enough for Jerome's family to know about it, long enough for procedures to be developed and equipment to be gathered, long enough for people to learn that some rules weren't meant to be broken. I walked back to check on the dog, who was still agitated, pacing in his enclosure and whining softly. He kept looking toward the funhouse, his ears flat against his head. I stayed with him until his anxiety seemed to ease, both of us keeping watch over the dark midway. The sun was still hours away, but for the first time since I'd arrived, I found myself actually looking forward to dawn. The chain snapped with a metallic ping that cut through the night air like a gunshot. I'd been walking toward the dog's shelter for my 5 a.m. check when I heard it. That sharp, final sound of metal giving way under pressure. The German Shepherd came bolting out of his enclosure, chain dragging behind him, whimpering in a way that made my chest tight. "Hey boy, what's wrong?" I called, but he didn't even slow down. He ran straight past me toward the back of the park, stopping every few yards to look over his shoulder and make sure I was following. This wasn't normal dog behavior. This was the kind of desperate urgency you see in movies when Lassie's trying to tell everyone that Timmy fell down the well. Except instead of a well, we were heading toward the lake, and Rule 6 was pretty clear about avoiding that area completely. The dog reached the water's edge and started pawing at something floating near the shore, his whines getting more frantic by the second. I caught up to him and shined my flashlight on the water, already knowing what I was going to find, but hoping I was wrong. Another flesh object bobbed in the shallow water like some kind of horrible fishing lure. This one was bigger than the first, maybe the size of a cantaloupe, and it was moving more actively, pulsing and contracting like it was trying to swim toward shore. "Location 12, I muttered, remembering the map, the lake. The dog looked up at me with those intelligent eyes, and I swear he nodded, like he was saying, "Yeah, that's the problem. Fix it." I found a long stick and used it to push the thing closer to shore, trying not to think about what I was actually doing. The smell hit me before I could get it all the way out of the water. That same rotten meat stench, but worse because it was wet. When I finally managed to drag it onto the muddy bank, the dog backed away and started whimpering again. I raised my boot and brought it down hard, same as before. The thing burst with a wet, disgusting sound that made my stomach lurch. Dark liquid spread across the mud and soaked into the ground, leaving behind that familiar black stain. That's when the water started moving. Not waves or ripples from the wind. There wasn't any wind. This was something underneath the surface, something big enough to displace water as it moved. The lake wasn't huge, maybe 50 yards across, but it was deep enough that I couldn't see the bottom even with my flashlight. The dog pressed against my leg, trembling. Whatever was down there, he could sense it better than I could, and he was terrified. "Time to go," I said, backing away from the water's edge. We made it about halfway back to the midway before I heard car doors slamming in the parking lot. multiple doors, which meant more than one person. I grabbed the dog's broken chain to keep him close and headed toward the entrance, my flashlight beam bouncing with each step. 3 people were walking through the gate, all carrying flashlights and moving like they knew exactly where they were going. I recognized Carol immediately, but the other 2 were strangers. A thin guy with messy black hair who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, and a woman with glasses and a professional-looking bag slung over her shoulder. "Peyton!" Carol called out when she saw me. "Everything okay? We saw your light by the lake. How did you—" I started, then stopped. There were too many questions and not enough time. There was another one, in the water. I took care of it. The thin guy stepped forward, and I could see dark circles under his eyes that made him look older than he probably was. "Another breach? That's the second one tonight." "Third," I corrected. There was one by the Ferris wheel around 2:30, but I didn't find anything physical. Just lights. The 3 of them exchanged looks that made it clear they knew exactly what I was talking about. "I'm Theo," the guy said. "Theo Reyes. I was the guard here 3 months ago. The one who quit after 2 weeks? That's what Jerome tells people." Theo's laugh had no humor in it. "Truth is, I never left. Been living in an old trailer about a mile down the road trying to help guards survive their shifts." The woman with glasses stepped forward. "Maggie Santiago, local historian. I've been documenting incidents at this park for the past 2 years." "Incidents," I repeated. "Deaths," Carol said bluntly. "Guards who didn't make it through their first week. Guards who broke the rules and disappeared. Guards who followed the rules perfectly and still didn't survive because they were alone and unprepared." I looked down at the dog, who was sitting calmly now that the other people were here, like their presence made him feel safer. "How many?" 17 in the last 5 years, Maggie said, pulling a notebook from her bag, though the actual number is probably higher. Some people just disappear and there's no way to know if they came here first. Jesus. I sat down hard on a nearby bench, the weight of that number hitting me like a physical blow. "And Jerome just keeps hiring people?" "Jerome's trying to maintain a balance," Theo said. "This place, it's not just haunted. It's a prison. The rules aren't about keeping you safe. They're about keeping the spirits contained." Carol sat down next to me, her voice gentler than it had been earlier. "The park is built on the site of a traveling carnival that burned down in 1987. 7 performers died in the fire, including 2 children. They were buried in unmarked graves behind the lake because no one knew who they were or where they came from. Carnival people," Maggie added. "Transients. Society's invisible. No one looked for them, no one mourned them properly. They've been trapped here ever since, getting stronger and more desperate as the years pass." I thought about the voice on the phone, the way it had sounded barely human. "The flesh things?" "Manifestations of their unrest," Maggie said. "They're trying to create physical anchor points in our world. If enough of them take hold, the barriers break down completely. And then what happens?" Theo's face went pale. "Then they're not trapped in the park anymore. They can go anywhere, do anything, and they're not exactly friendly after 35 years of being stuck here." The dog whined softly and pressed closer to my leg. I reached down to pet him, and Carol noticed the gesture. "He's not just a stray," she said. "His great-grandmother belonged to one of the performers who died. Dogs like him are sensitive to supernatural activity. That's why Jerome keeps one here, early warning system. And the rules? Developed over years by guards who survived long enough to figure out the patterns," Theo said. "Each rule corresponds to a specific trigger that could release the spirits completely. The Ferris wheel after 2 a.m. is when they're strongest. The carousel after 3 is when they start trying to break through. The funhouse is their main gathering point. Never go in there, ever." "What about the payphone?" "Communication system," Carol explained. "They can manipulate electronics when they're agitated. The numbers they give you are breach locations. places where they're trying to create those anchor points. I thought about the voice saying 7, about finding that disgusting lump behind the concession stand. And if I hadn't answered, the breach would have gotten bigger, Maggie said. Eventually, it would have been too large to destroy by conventional means. Conventional means, I repeated. As opposed to what? The three of them exchanged another look, and I got the feeling there were still things they weren't telling me. Let's focus on getting through the next 2 hours, Carol said. Sunrise is at 6:45. Once the sun comes up, the activity stops completely. They can only manifest in full darkness. 2 hours, I said, looking at my watch. It was 5:23 a.m. And then what? I go home and pretend this never happened? That's up to you, Theo said quietly. You can quit, like most people do. Jerome will find another guard and the cycle continues. Or you stay, Carol said. Help us figure out a permanent solution. Help us make sure the next person who takes this job doesn't have to face it alone. I looked around at their faces, tired, determined, scared but not running. People who'd chosen to stay and fight something that most people would never believe existed. The dog leaned against my leg, warm and solid and trusting, like he was voting for me to stick around. 2 hours, I said again. What do we need to do? The payphone started ringing again at 5:30, and this time it didn't stop. Ring after ring cut through the night air, that harsh mechanical sound echoing off the empty rides. I looked at Carol, Theo, and Maggie, all of us frozen on the bench like we were playing some twisted game of musical chairs. Answer it, Carol said finally. We need to know what's happening. I jogged over to the phone booth, the dog trotting beside me with his broken chain dragging. When I picked up the receiver, the voice on the other end was barely recognizable as human anymore, like someone trying to speak through a mouthful of gravel and broken glass. They're breaking through. The line went dead. 3 seconds later, it rang again. The barriers. Failing. Dead again. Ring again. Can't hold much longer. I hung up and backed away from the phone, but it kept ringing. Over and over, that same desperate mechanical shriek. It's not giving me locations anymore, I called to the others. It's just panicking. That's when I noticed the Ferris wheel. The lights I'd seen earlier, those soft star-like points scattered across the frame, were burning brighter now. Bright enough that I could see them clearly from here, pulsing like a heartbeat. And the carousel had started moving again, but faster this time. The painted horses were spinning in a blur of faded colors, their glass eyes catching my flashlight beam as they whirled past. Oh hell, Theo muttered, standing up from the bench. They're making a push, all of them at once. The funhouse laughter started up again, but it wasn't the 3-minute burst from earlier. This was constant now, a steady stream of children's voices mixed with something deeper and hungrier. The sound rolled across the midway like a wave, making my teeth ache. Why now? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. Maggie checked her watch. Sunrise is in an hour and 15 minutes. They can sense it coming. So they're trying to break free before the sun comes up, I said. Before they lose their chance. Exactly. Carol was already moving, pulling supplies from her canvas bag, which means we're about to see more manifestations than you've dealt with all night, probably at every restricted location simultaneously. The dog whined and pressed against my leg, his fur standing on end. When I looked down at him, he was staring toward the lake, his ears flat against his head. There, I said, pointing my flashlight toward the water. Something's happening at the lake. We could see it from here. The surface of the water was churning like something massive was moving underneath. Not just one thing either, multiple disturbances, creating overlapping ripples that spread out in all directions. Ferris wheel too, Theo said, his voice tight. Look at the base. I turned my flashlight toward the ride and saw them immediately. 3 flesh-colored lumps clustered around the metal support posts, each one bigger than anything I'd seen before. They were pulsing in unison, like they were connected somehow. "Carousel!" Maggie called out, her voice sharp with urgency. The spinning horses were slowing down now, and I could see more of the disgusting manifestations scattered across the platform. They seemed to be growing as I watched, expanding like balloons being filled with something thick and viscous. "And the funhouse," Carol said grimly. The entrance, that grinning clown mouth, was practically glowing with the things. They were clustered around the doorway like some kind of horrible welcoming committee, their flesh-colored surfaces reflecting the light from our flashlights. "They're skipping the phone system," I realized. "No more warnings, no more playing by the rules. They're just going for it." "Which means we need to move fast," Carol said, handing me a pair of thick work gloves. "Split up, hit all the locations before they get too big to destroy." "Split up?" I looked around at the chaos, the spinning lights, the churning water, the constant laughter. "Are you insane?" "We don't have a choice," Theo said, pulling on his own gloves. "If even one of those clusters reaches critical mass, the whole containment system fails." The payphone was still ringing, that mechanical shriek cutting through the supernatural noise like a fire alarm. I wanted to rip the thing off its post, but something told me that would only make things worse. "I'll take the lake," Carol said. "I know the terrain best." "Ferris wheel," Theo called, already jogging toward the ride. "Carousel," Maggie said, adjusting her glasses and hefting what looked like a crowbar from her bag. That left me with the funhouse, of course. "What about Rule 3? I called after them. "Never enter the funhouse?" "Don't enter it," Carol shouted back. "Just clear the entrance, and whatever you do, don't look directly at the clown face when the laughter stops." Great. More rules I didn't understand. I ran toward the funhouse with the dog beside me, his chain clanking against the asphalt. The laughter was so loud now it felt like it was coming from inside my skull, and the flesh objects around the entrance were definitely bigger than they'd been 30 seconds ago. Some of them were the size of basketballs now, pulsing and writhing like they were trying to hatch something. I raised my boot and brought it down on the nearest one. It burst with that familiar, wet, disgusting sound, but this time the smell was so strong it made my eyes water. Dark liquid spread across the ground, but instead of soaking in like before, it seemed to be pooling, forming a small puddle that reflected the funhouse lights. The dog barked sharply, a warning sound that made me look up. The clown face above the entrance was moving, not the mechanical movement you'd expect from an animatronic, but something more organic, like the painted features were shifting and rearranging themselves. I crushed another flesh object, then another. Each one that burst made the pooled liquid bigger, and I was starting to worry that I was making things worse instead of better. But the dog seemed calmer with each one I destroyed, so I kept going. From across the midway, I could hear similar wet bursting sounds as the others worked. Theo was shouting something I couldn't make out over the laughter, and I caught a glimpse of Carol's flashlight beam sweeping back and forth by the lake. The last flesh object was the biggest, easily the size of a watermelon. When I brought my boot down on it, the thing didn't just burst, it exploded. Dark liquid splashed everywhere, covering my boots and the lower part of my pants. The smell was so overwhelming I had to step back and breathe through my mouth. But as soon as it was destroyed, the laughter from the funhouse cut off abruptly. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. I remembered Carol's warning about not looking at the clown face, but it was too late. I was already staring up at it, and what I saw made my blood freeze. The painted smile was gone. In its place was a gaping hole filled with darkness so complete it seemed to swallow light. And in that darkness, I could see movement. Shapes that might have been faces or hands or something else entirely. The dog grabbed my pant leg with his teeth and pulled, hard enough to make me stumble backward. The movement broke whatever spell the clown face had on me, and I managed to look away. "Good boy," I gasped, reaching down to scratch his ears with shaking hands. The others were jogging back toward the center of the midway, their faces grim but relieved. Carol's boots were soaked with lake water, and Theo had dark stains on his jacket that I didn't want to think about too hard. "Everyone okay?" Carol called out. "Define okay," I said, looking down at my own stained clothes. "Alive and not possessed," Maggie said dryly. "That's about as good as it gets around here." The payphone had finally stopped ringing, and the Ferris wheel lights were fading back to their earlier soft glow. The carousel had stopped spinning entirely, and the funhouse entrance looked normal again, just a painted clown face with a mechanical smile. "Is it over?" I asked. Theo checked his watch. "For tonight. Sunrise is in 40 minutes, and they've used up most of their energy on that last push." I looked around at the four of us, tired, dirty, probably traumatized, but still standing. "So, what happens now? Do I go home and pretend this was all a weird dream?" "That's up to you," Carol said, echoing what Theo had told me earlier. "Jerome will understand if you want to quit. Most people do. But if I quit, he just hires someone else. Someone who has to face this alone." "Yeah," Theo said quietly. "That's how it works." I thought about those 17 guards who hadn't made it. People who'd taken this job for the same reasons I had, needing money, wanting a fresh start, looking for something simple and straightforward. People who died because they didn't have backup, didn't have people who understood what they were facing. The dog was sitting beside me now, leaning against my leg like he'd been doing it his whole life. When I looked down at him, he was watching me with those intelligent eyes, like he was waiting to see what I'd decide. "Jerome knows, doesn't he?" I said, "about all of this. He's not just some clueless supervisor." Carol nodded. "He's been managing the situation for 15 years, hiring guards, hoping they'll learn the rules and stick around long enough to help maintain the balance." "Balance," I repeated. "That's what this is about. Not keeping the spirits happy, but keeping them contained." "Exactly," Maggie said. "The rules aren't arbitrary. They're a carefully developed system for maintaining supernatural equilibrium. Break them, and the spirits get stronger. Follow them perfectly, and they stay trapped but manageable. And the guards who die? Acceptable losses," Theo said bitterly. "At least, that's how Jerome sees it. Better to lose a few people than risk the spirits escaping into the general population." I looked around at the park, the faded rides, the peeling paint, the general air of decay that I'd noticed when I first arrived. It wasn't just an old amusement park, it was a prison, and Jerome had been hiring guards to serve as wardens without telling them what they were really signing up for. "That's messed up," I said. "Yeah," Carol agreed. "It is, but it's also reality. These spirits aren't going anywhere, and someone has to keep them contained." "So what are you suggesting? That I stay and become part of Jerome's system?" "We're suggesting you stay and help us find a better system," Theo said. "One that doesn't involve sacrificing guards to maintain the balance." I thought about my life back in Charleston, the failed business, the debt, the humiliation of having to start over. Then I thought about Marcus and the way he'd looked at me when he'd cleaned out our business account, like I was just another Mark, another sucker who'd made it easy for him. At least here, the monsters were honest about being monsters. What would that look like? I asked. A better system. We're still figuring that out, Maggie admitted. But having more people who understand the situation, who can work together instead of facing it alone, that's a start. The sky was starting to lighten in the east, just a faint gray line on the horizon. Dawn was coming, and with it, the end of the supernatural activity. For tonight, anyway. "I need to think about it," I said. "Fair enough," Carol said, "but think fast. Jerome will be here in a few hours expecting a report, and you'll need to decide what you're going to tell him." They started gathering their equipment, preparing to leave before full daylight. Theo paused beside me, his expression serious. "For what it's worth," he said, "you handled tonight better than most people would have. You followed the rules, you adapted when things got weird, and you didn't panic when the situation escalated. I felt like I was panicking the entire time. Maybe. But you kept moving, kept thinking, kept doing what needed to be done. That's what matters. He headed toward the parking lot with the others, leaving me alone with the dog and the gradually lightening sky. I sat down on the bench and tried to process everything that had happened in the last 8 hours. When I'd taken this job, I'd been running away from my problems, looking for something simple and isolated, somewhere I could hide until I figured out what to do with my life. Instead, I'd found something that made my previous troubles look like minor inconveniences. But I'd also found something else. People who'd chosen to stay and fight instead of running away. People who'd looked at an impossible situation and decided to try to make it better, even when it would have been easier to just walk away. The dog whined softly and put his head on my knee. When I scratched behind his ears, he leaned into the touch like he was trying to tell me something. "What do you think, boy?" I asked him. "Should I stick around?" He looked up at me with those too intelligent eyes and wagged his tail once, like he was saying, "Yeah, I think you should." The first rays of sunlight hit the top of the Ferris wheel, and just like that, the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the park all night simply vanished. The air felt normal again. The shadows looked like regular shadows, and the rides went back to being just old, faded amusement park equipment. I stood up and stretched, my back aching from the tension I'd been carrying all night. The dog stood too, staying close to my side as we walked back toward the trailer. Tomorrow night, I'd have to make the same walk, check the same locations, answer the same phone. But if I stayed, if I chose to be part of whatever Carol, Theo, and Maggie were building, I wouldn't have to do it alone. I looked back at the parking lot, where I could see their car pulling onto the access road. They'd be back tomorrow, ready to face another night of supernatural chaos, ready to keep fighting for a better solution. The question was whether I'd be here to help them.